Ahluwalia. He is, as we all know, he needs no introduction. Everybody knows him. Everybody in India knows him. But as formality demands, I will go ahead with my introduction. He was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, a position which carried the rank of a cabinet minister. He tendered his resignation from this post in May 2014. He was previously the first director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Mr. Ahluwalia was born in Rawalpindi, and he's an alumni of the St. Patrick's High School, Secunderabad, and the Delhi Public School. And then he went on to graduate at the Stephens College, Delhi, and later he was a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, where he studied. And he is a graduate who obtained an MA in philosophy, politics, and economics. He also did his MPhil from the St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He has received several honorary degrees, including an honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford and an honorary degree of Doctor of Philosophy from the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. He's an honorary fellow of Magdalen College. After graduating from the University of Oxford, Mr. Montek Singh joined the World Bank in 1968 at the age of 28. He became the youngest division chief of the World Bank's bureaucracy, in charge of the income distribution division in the World Bank's Development Research Center. He returned to India in 1979 and took up the position of economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. He has held several senior positions as a civil servant, including Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs in the Finance Ministry, and Finance Secretary. In 1998, he was appointed member of the Planning Commission. In 2001, he was chosen by the Board of International Monetary Fund to be the first director of the newly created Independent Evaluation Office, in which capacity he supervised several studies critical of various aspects of the functioning of the IMF. Mr. Ahluwalia has been a key figure in the Indian economic reform process. In June 2004, he resigned from the IMF position to take up the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission as part of the United UPA Alliance government in New Delhi. He has consistently pushed for economic reforms involving a shift from the earlier reliance on extensive government control over the economy with high levels of protections to a much more open economy with a large role for the private sector responding to market forces and greater openness to imports, foreign technology, and direct foreign investment. The President of India awarded him the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian honor for public service. He is an author and he has authored several books, and he has many articles to his credit. Sir, we look forward to hearing from you on the way India is and the way India will be in the future. Once again, we welcome you, sir, to this beautiful evening. Thank you. Now it's over to our president, Mr. Hari Kumar.
Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, distinguished guests, past presidents, and chamber members. It's indeed a great occasion to be here today to introduce the speaker for the fourth session of the India Forward series, Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, civil servant, economist, and former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. To the benefit of the speaker and invited guests who are logging in for the first time, let me say two words about the chamber. Cochin Chamber of Commerce and Industry, established in 1857, is among the oldest chambers of the commerce in the country and has played a stellar role in shaping the policies of the government by strategic interventions at the policy making stage. We even claim to have mooted the idea of a Cochin port in Kerala, as this port has shaped not only the city of Cochin, but also of Kerala and perhaps even that of South India, because the cities in other states which are closer to Kerala use Cochin as their major port. Every month, we have a CEO forum discussion wherein top CEOs log in or even deliberate over a breakfast, and we deliberate on various topics of contemporary interest, and topics vary from cryptocurrency to water conservation and sewage disposal, even to banking reforms, on which we had a talk the other day. India Forward is a new series which we planned this year, and this is the fourth session. This has been received well, is going great, and getting good reviews. For the benefit of the honorable guest, let me tell you that Shri Jairam Ramesh, Mr. S. Gurumurthy, and Shri Yashwant Sinha were the speakers in the previous sessions. The chamber also believes in being a responsible corporate citizen and did our bit to CSR activity by donating a high-cost medical equipment to a government hospital. The handing over was done by the Honorable Minister of Industries, Kerala, Shri P. Rajiv. I would also say that the Chamber CSR Fund also has got the ATG exemption, so that tax benefits can be availed by donating companies, and your CSR obligations can be met through the Chamber, so that we can do something meaningful for the society at large. We also have planned a workshop on personal branding by Ms. Jessica Mondronia, and the date will be announced shortly. We have also scheduled an Abdul Kalam Memorial Lecture on 8 January, and the keynote speaker is Dr. Madhav Gadgil, who authored the Gadgil Committee report. As the speaker has already been introduced, I'm not delving deeper into that. I would just say that a much sought after thought leader and economist, he has left an indelible stamp in shaping India as a global power, which it is today. He has consistently pushed for economic reforms and involving a shift from the earlier reliance on extensive government control over the economy with high level of protection to a much more open economy with a larger role for the private sector. He also has clear views on the economy, and I read recently in an interview wherein it stated that the growth of 9.5% projected by the RBI is a bit overambitious, as it does not adequately reflect the role of the informal sector, as it is not doing to the extent of that of the formal sector. He had also stated that reviving investment is even more important if we have to get back to higher growth rate in the medium term. And his opinion is that private investment will revive only after capacity utilization in the economy gets back to normal levels, and the potential investors see the need for expanding capacities and believe that expanding public investment is the best way to kickstart growth and put India in the growth momentum. This may increase the fiscal deficit, but he believes that an increase in fiscal deficit by investing in the public infrastructure is much better than increase due to subsidies. I can go on and on various thought he has on the economy. I would now request Padma Vibhushan Sri Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, the great economist, to talk to us on his vision of India Forward. The stage is all yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Mr. Hariharan. I'm really honored by being invited to address, even if only virtually, this particular event organized by the Cochin Chamber. I see that you have 62 participants in all, which is quite a lot. So let me say hello to all of you. You're spread out in digital space, so I can't see you. I can only see the ones who are the main panelists, but you're all, it's nice to be able to address you virtually. Now, when I was asked to speak on the prospects of the economy, I sort of said to myself that as a group of businessmen, we are not really interested in academic discussions on the economy, nor are you really interested in a political view, because at any given time, the economy is always subjected to academic analysis. And of course, in any functioning democracy, economic performance is also a political currency. So generally, the government always says that we are doing wonderful things, and the opposition always says that you're not doing wonderful things. So how do you get some sense of balance? So what I thought I would do is I'd make a few comments, give you my views in two separate portions. One is to make a few comments on the short term, and the next one is to look at the somewhat longer term. Now, this is particularly important at this point because the short term has been dramatic. I mean, after all, this statement could be said at any given time, but if you were in a normal kind of situation, the difference between short and long would not be so important. We're in a very abnormal situation because we were very badly hit by the pandemic last year. And it's not just we that were hit, the world was very badly hit. So I think we have to keep in mind that this is an unusual year, not only for India, but also for the whole world. And equally, therefore, the short-term current state of the economy is we are recovering from this very bad hit. And I think there's a debate going on even today on what is the pace of that recovery. I mean, is it really V-shaped? Is it as fast as it could be? And so on. And this is fair enough under any normal kind of circumstances. But I think the critical thing at the present is that we are seeing we are not. One thing is very clear: we were badly hit, but it's not an L-shaped recovery. Where the economy gets hit and then remains flat on the ground. That's possible. That's certainly not what the case is. The economy was hit, and the economy is recovering. Now, there can be a debate on whether the economy is recovering rapidly enough or not rapidly enough. My guess is that what we are seeing is a recovery process where in this year, the economy will probably get back, towards the end of the year, it'll get back roughly to where it was before the pandemic. Now, it's up to you whether you want to call this V-shaped or not. I mean, at one point, people were even saying that during the pandemic year, it would be V-shaped in the sense that after the initial hit, the economy would rebound. And the early estimates of what would be the growth in 2021 reflected that kind of optimism. But we now know that the economy declined by 7.3% or something like that in the pandemic year, and it's now recovering. There is a difference of opinion between different observers on how fast it's recovering. But even there, most people kind of veer between saying 8 or some say a little above 9. When the economy goes down by 7.5% or something like that, and then recovers at 8% on that low base, then basically at the end of the year, it's just getting back to where it was. Now, you can have a separate debate on whether we could have done better. I mean, that's, if you like, the analysis of the short run. Could it have been managed better? There are views on both sides. I won't go into that. Probably, my own perception is that we underestimated the extent to which it would go down. And therefore, we underestimated the extent to which a stimulus was needed. And therefore, my guess is we could have had more stimulus just for this 1 year. But opinions can vary on this, and that's not terribly important. It's not an L-shaped recovery. It is a recovery where there's an upturn, and probably in the beginning of the year 2022-23, we will have made up the loss, and sort of we'll be back to where we were. So now, I mean, really, there is only one qualification in all this, and that is that this judgment is based on what we know about the formal sector. Because in the formal sector, you can see that recovery in many sectors, but even there, not in all. I mean, for example, the hospitality industry, the hotels industry, the airlines, tourism, the contact sectors, the service sectors, they're not anywhere near where they were in the pre-pandemic period, but they're getting better. The real problem is the informal sector. And there is a debate going on that a lot of our judgment about how the economy is doing is really based on data about the formal sector. And traditionally, the assumption has been that if the formal sector is growing at 8% or whatever it is, then the informal sector must also be growing at 8%. What the critics say is that this time around, that's not true. That is, the informal sector has been worse hit. I think it has been worse hit, and therefore the most of the growth projections which assume that the informal sector is growing at the same rate as the formal sector probably exaggerate the overall GDP growth. The problem is actually bigger. See, another aspect of this, which is relevant for the future, is that if the informal sector is not doing well, but since 90% of our people are in the informal sector, even though the actual GDP produced in the informal sector may not be much more than 35 or 40%, most of the people are employed in the informal sector. Household incomes and household income expectations are not bouncy. Certainly for those employed in the formal sector, things are looking a lot better. I mean, they no longer feel that the economy is on a downslide. Those who actually have jobs do not feel that they're going to lose them. Maybe some of the formal sector firms are even beginning to think of hiring afresh. But for those in the informal sector, that's not actually true. So we have to keep in mind that the distributional consequences of this recovery are adverse. But that's not all. It also has an impact on the pace of the recovery. Because, if consumption is weak, and that is what the data show, the data show basically that the growth of consumption on the demand side, the growth of consumption has not yet kicked off. And obviously, unless the growth of consumption kicks off properly, you won't see the economy growing very rapidly. So there is a question, when the pandemic has been overcome, at what rate will we grow? And linked to this is an uncertainty about when will the pandemic be overcome. Because this is not an India, exclusively India problem. It's a problem globally, that the rise of the Omicron variant has created a huge amount of uncertainty in the rest of the world. Is the pandemic actually over? And most people would say that at the moment, it's uncertain. It's certainly not over. What we don't know is this new thing, how much of a disruption is it going to cause? And clearly, if it does cause an extensive disruption, it'll affect growth in other countries, it'll affect travel between countries, it'll affect trade relationships. The short answer is this is a question mark. I'm not suggesting that we should start concluding the worst, but what I'm really saying is that it's a bit too early to be certain about what the prospects are here. So that's the short term. Now, when you come to the longer term, many government spokespersons have said that they are hoping that, let's say next year, they're hoping that they will get something like 7+% growth rate. Some have said that over a longer run, the growth rate could even go to 10%. I think what that suggests is, and this is good in my view, that the government is not getting the public ready for a slow growth. Now remember, in China, for example, the government's taken a very different position. The Chinese government has come to the conclusion that China cannot maintain the high growth that it used to have, and they've formally said that next year China's growth rate will be 5.5%. I don't know, for example, I suppose by the time the budget is presented, we will have a formal projection by the finance minister of what is the growth rate we expect to see in the year ahead. My own feeling is the real concern that people would have is that when we declare that the pandemic is over, are we going to say that now the economy is going to go back to the growth rate that it had pre-pandemic, which would actually be somewhere between 4 and 5%, because the economy has slowed down for several years? Or are we going to say that, that slowing down was a temporary factor for a variety of reasons, and we're now going to go back to the much higher growth rates that we had earlier, which were, depending on which years you take, somewhere between 7.5% and 8+%. Now, in my view, we need growth rates of at least 7.5 if you want to generate employment. I mean, that is the other negative thing about the current data. The available data seems to suggest that employment is not expanding. And what has actually happened is that urban employment has shrunk, rural employment has increased. But this is not a very positive development. What it really means is that people have gone back home because urban jobs have been lost, and they're taking whatever jobs they can find, and generally at very low wages or income levels. Therefore, looking forward, one has to ask oneself, what is the kind of GDP growth we need to reverse this process? And to my mind, that GDP growth has to be over 7%. I personally do not think in the short run it's possible to aim at 8% and so on, simply because the world is also slowed down. So what happens in India depends on India's inherent capabilities, India's policies, and also global growth. And we are not growing independently of the rest of the world. That's why the Chinese have scaled down their growth rate. They may have scaled it down because there are tensions between the developed countries and China, and they feel that will affect their trade. So they're realistically conveying to their public that please don't expect very high growth. We're going to have 5.5% GDP growth in the coming year. We have to wait and see what the finance minister announces in her budget speech as her expectation in the coming year. But my own view would be that if we simply go back to where we were before the pandemic, between 4 and 5%, which is actually not difficult at all. So we will get growth. But if you're talking about 4 and 5% growth, it will not generate the kind of employment that we need to create a bit of social harmony in the country. If you're aiming for more, part of the problem is that we don't know what the world situation is going to be like. I mean, obviously, if the global situation is good, then our prospect of getting higher growth is better. But at the moment, that global situation looks highly uncertain. And I mean, I'm not an expert in what global trends are, but all of you who read international newspapers are aware of all these concerns. So really, the question is, what is India's inherent growth potential on the supply side? And what is it that we have to do in order to achieve it? Now, I have no doubt that on the supply side, in terms of inherent growth potential, India can grow at 7.5% for several years. We are really very far behind the productivity frontier of the world, even the productivity frontier in the more advanced developing countries. And I think if we close that gap between where our productivity is and where it could be, and that's true of both industry and agriculture, and to some extent also in certain areas of services, we should be able to stimulate a faster growth rate. And that raises the question, what is the set of policies that we need in order to create a conducive atmosphere for growth to take place? Now, there, I think Mr. Hariharan sort of described me as being pro certain policies, and I think he gave a very good summary of my views and prejudices. So let me just sort of, in a sense, repeat them. Number one, and I think on this, by the way, there is now a lot of consensus. That trend has come over several governments, that the growth in India is going to be led by the private sector. I don't think anyone is dreaming of public sector led growth in a lot of areas, but public sector has a very important role to play in infrastructure. And the strategy for stimulating the private sector is to give it a much better infrastructure than we have been able to do thus far. Now, how do you do that? I think you do that, you have to give a lead. Government has a very big role to play in pushing for infrastructure improvements and logistics improvements. I mean, the two actually go together. So it's not just hard infrastructure. It's also a lot of logistics improvements which deals with our processes so that interaction with the rest of the world becomes seamless and easy. This infrastructure development will require heavy investment. And this is, especially in the energy area, it's particularly complex because we are at the brink of having to deal with climate change. So the essence of climate change is that we cannot carry on relying on energy intensity, energy production, which is very intensive in emissions that it produces. So we need energy, there's no question about that. That energy will have to come dominantly from more electricity, and that electricity has to come from renewables, and that requires a lot of investment and a lot of institutional change and a lot of soft policies to enable the transition. So that is one of India's biggest challenges, and that's a challenge, quite frankly, which the central government and the state governments together have to take up. In that process, it may well be that some amount of investment will have to be done by the public sector itself, particularly when it comes to expanding grid infrastructure and so on. But a lot of the investment in electricity generation increasingly will really come from the private sector. And if we have well-functioning distribution companies that are not constantly making losses, there will be private investors willing to come forward. But that will only happen if the distribution companies are themselves not broke. And that's a huge issue. It's an issue where both the center and the state governments have to collaborate in order to create a much better working environment for distribution companies to function. But otherwise, except for this infrastructure, it's really the private sector that will lead the fray. That's point number one. Within the private sector, you've got the larger industry and you've got small and medium industry. Now, I think, we often say that the small and medium industry is very important, and indeed it is very important. But I think we have to also recognize that in India, we don't have enough medium industry. We don't have a structure where small industry grows into bigger or medium industry. In fact, we have a relatively small medium industry segment and a huge proliferation of very small enterprises. Somewhere, to give you the data, I think almost 85% of all the establishments in non-agriculture are one-person establishments, maybe with some family labor. They don't hire even one worker. So that gives you a sense of how this part of industry is structured. And looking 5-10 years ahead, I think what will happen is that formalization will provide an opportunity for the more efficient of the small and medium industries to expand and expand their space. But I think this will be at the expense of the weaker amongst these industries, which will actually get squeezed out. So this is a tough one. I think if you just call it formalization, it looks very good. But if you say actually we are going to bring about a structural change where a lot of the small and micro enterprises will ultimately fold up and the people employed in there will become employees in other industries in the same sector which are stronger and will expand. I mean, it will generate employment, but we need to have both a politics and a set of policies that can allow this to happen seamlessly. That's a huge challenge. I don't know how the government plans to do it, but I think we have to recognize it. This is certainly going to happen because of formalization and modern technology. I mean, already, one of the things that digitalization has done is that it has enabled small businesses to have a very wide reach through digital platforms. And to some extent, the pandemic has increased the, if you like, the practice of people buying things online, which again has meant that those enterprises that are able to operate this modern system will do very well. But by definition, if they're doing very well, then some of the others which were operating a non-modern platform will get squeezed out. And I think we have to accept that. A related question to this whole business of how is the government going to carry all these investments needed? I mean, government needs to invest in infrastructure, government needs to invest in agriculture, government needs to invest in urban infrastructure because, climate change is going to produce huge weather fluctuations. Many more extreme events, concentrations of rainfall, more flooding, etc. In order to manage that, you need much more investment in the urban infrastructure. Otherwise, we just will not be providing an environment which is conducive to business. That raises the question of the fiscal deficit. And, most economists, when they talk about reforms, they would say that the first requirement of reforms is macroeconomic balance. The macroeconomic balance means the government's fiscal deficit should not be too large. And when they say the government's fiscal deficit, they're not saying central government fiscal deficit. They're saying central and state government fiscal deficits taken together. Now, frankly, by any standard, if you look at our fiscal deficit of the center and state governments, it is much larger than in most other developing countries. So as a matter of fact, our governments, it's funny, our governments it's not as if they're spending a huge proportion of GDP, but they're just not taxing enough. So they're covering their expenditure by borrowing, and that borrowing is reflected in large fiscal deficits. So India's fiscal deficit, the general government, in other words, central and local, is more than double the fiscal deficit of many, many other developing countries of a comparable size. So one of the issues really is, it doesn't matter. I don't think this is a big problem when we are in the middle of a pandemic. Because in the pandemic, there was a lot of demand, there was a need for stimulus. You could even argue that, and I have argued that we shouldn't worry about the fiscal deficit in the current year. But the logic of not worrying about the fiscal deficit in the current year is that you must produce a credible strategy that when the pandemic is over, we will quickly bring the fiscal deficit down to some degree. Now, bringing it down to some degree in an environment in which you have to expand government expenditure becomes that much more difficult. So let me give you some examples. Our combined deficit, center and states together, is somewhere around 9% of GDP. And you may want to bring it down to 5% combined. That would be quite a reasonable combined deficit, although it would still be higher than many other countries. So that means you need a 4 percentage point turnaround in the fiscal deficit. Okay, that's one thing. But on the expenditure side, it's not as if we are saying we need to cut government expenditure. We need to increase government expenditure in health. Most people would say you need over the next 5 years, you should have another 1% increase in government expenditure in health. You probably need another 1% increase in government expenditure in education. That's 2%. You need a big expansion in infrastructure, of which maybe the government should be doing another 1%. So that's 3%. We are not doing nearly enough on research. I mean, the idea that India will become a major, serious competitor with other developing countries when it is spending such a low amount of its GDP on research is not credible. We are actually falling behind, and all you have to do is look at the comparison between India and China in terms of the number of their universities that are ranked in the top 500. I mean, we have only one, the Institute of Science. They have about 13. So clearly we need to do lots more research, and research has to be done by certainly the private sector, but the underpinning, the basic research is always done through public funding. And that is going to require money. So I already said 3 percentage points for health and education and infrastructure. And frankly, you can add 1% for research, including research on agriculture, because climate change is going to put a huge stress on our agricultural productivity. So that's 4%. And then in addition to that, you probably almost certainly have to increase defense expenditure by about 0.5% and maybe even more. We are geopolitically in a very difficult neighborhood, and the way the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific is working, we cannot assume that we can ignore all these factors. So now, if you look at that, that's 4.5% of GDP, which has to be additional expenditure, along with maybe a 4 percentage point reduction in the fiscal deficit. That's a turnaround of something like 8.5% of GDP. That's huge. And not immediately, but let's say over a 5-year period. So the question is, do we have a credible fiscal strategy where we can pose it in these terms and say, this is our medium-term fiscal plan, this is what the growth is going to be, this is what the expenditures are going to be. And in the old days, when you had planning, all these things were calculated over a 5-year period. That's abolished. So we only have a 1-year budgeting process. But I think that's fine. For purposes of the fiscal deficit, we need to project for the next 5 years. And we need to do it not just for the central government, we also need to do it for the state government. So to my mind, fiscal reform of that kind is very crucial. Now, how do you achieve this turnaround in order to accommodate both the reduction in the fiscal deficit and the additional expenditures? You can only do it either by cutting out certain expenditures, which you don't regard as very crucial, or by raising the tax rate. Now, on expenditures, the real thing to cut out are really the many, many, many freebies which state governments continuously give. I don't know what the central government can do about it. It's a state government issue. And I think it's very much embedded in the kind of politics we have. Every time we have a state election, whoever's competing for the election announces all kinds of additional benefits, which actually burden the budget. Similarly, you need to get rid of some of these freebies, and I don't see much political support for that. You also need to increase the ratio of tax to GDP. And lots of studies have been done which show that the ratio of tax to GDP in India is too low compared to what its per capita income is. And some studies would say that we can certainly increase the tax ratio by 4 or 5% of the GDP. Now, increasing the tax ratio doesn't necessarily mean raising tax rates, but it means a much, much better more modern tax administration. Now, to some extent, things like the GST, which sort of bring more and more industries into the formal sector, will ultimately increase the tax rate, particularly when the information on GSTs becomes correlated with the income tax which the businesses should pay. So that's a positive development. But I think there's a lot of reform of the GST which is needed. Bring the items that are outside the GST at the moment under the GST. And I think also the government has accepted this proposition that we need to reduce the number of rates. There are too many rates. And I don't know whether there will be progress on it in the next meeting of the Fiscal Council, which I think is scheduled to be held shortly. But I would say that, and by the way, unlike in the past, the GST cannot be changes in the GST cannot be done in the budget. They can only be done by the GST Council. So that's one very good thing, that we don't have to focus too much attention at the time of the budget on what's happening to indirect tax rates. That will be done under the GST Council itself. And I hope that it will be possible to bring about the kind of reforms that people have been talking about. I mean, the government has been talking about this, but let's see if we can get it done. But it just tells you that if you want to tell a consistent macro story, these resource mobilization efforts are important. And in this context, the monetization of the pipeline of existing infrastructure projects is, in my view, a very good idea. I mean, it's a way of attracting money without incurring government debt. You've got these projects there. The risk and uncertainty associated with the project phase is no longer there because the projects are functioning. They are generating revenue. You'll be able to get investment. And I hope that the government is able to achieve what it wants. Now, there'll be some controversy. I mean, some people are opposed to the idea of selling public sector assets in principle. I don't think that's all that logical. The view that we mustn't sell the family silver doesn't apply here, because what you're doing here is you're selling the existing family silver in order to buy more family silver. I mean, you're not selling these projects in order to use the money on consumption or subsidies. You're selling these projects in order to fund new projects, and when they start generating return, you can sell those also. So I think that I hope that there will be some broad public support for this. I think the government should try to build that public support up. But that's one way of doing the investment we need without incurring a large fiscal deficit. So that's one side of the reform program. I think the other side of the reform program, which is actually quite important, is we need to hugely improve the efficiency of the banking system. This goes into the question of banking sector reform. Again, the trouble with reform is in every country, everybody is in favor of reform. The only question is, what do they regard as reform? So I think personally that we will have to free our public sector banks from the control of the government. And when I say the government, I don't mean the Reserve Bank of India, I mean the Finance Ministry. I have on many occasions argued that what we should do is amend the law so that the RBI has the same power over public sector banks that it does over private sector banks. See, in a private sector bank, if the management is not doing a good job and the RBI feels that they are subpar, they can actually remove the management. That's not true in a public sector bank. I mean, they can only write to the government, and it's the government's job then to change the management if it wants to change, and it has never done so. So, to my mind, if we trust the RBI with regulating private sector banks, we should trust the RBI regulating public sector banks to the same extent. And in fact, the Finance Ministry should have nothing to do with the running of public sector banks. This is no political party is actually willing to accept this recommendation. So, if the present government doesn't do it, they could say that the previous government didn't want to do it either. And if you took a vote, somehow there'll be a lot of resistance to this. And I think we need to discuss, can we actually reform the banking system without getting rid of this? Currently, there's a lot of talk that we will privatize 2 banks, public sector banks. It's good. I mean, I would support that if they can get it done. But the name of the game is not to pick 2 banks and privatize them. These are not very important banks. The name of the game is to take the top banks that we have in the public sector and give them more freedom. Now, you need this freedom given the change that is occurring in banking technology. I mean, with the growth of digital access, digital banking, fintechs, new applications, I mean, unless our banks are very nimble and flexible and can use all these new developments to maintain their market share, they will simply lose market share to the private sector banks. That is already happening. I mean, if you look at the trend, the private sector share of credit is shooting up and the public sector share is actually falling. So failure to modernize the public sector banks is not only preventing these banks from being efficient and therefore serving the need for an expanding economy, they're actually also reducing the size of the public sector, which is not a sensible thing to do. So I think banking reform, in my view, is a very, very crucial part of it. I mean, let me spend a couple of minutes on the last aspect, and that is the importance of maintaining an open economy. I think one of the consequences of what has happened in the world is that there's some rethinking, partly because in the West itself, as Western hegemony has gone down and they feel that they are threatened, they've been rolling up protectionist barriers in Western countries, which were earlier, if you like, major advocates for an open global economy. Now, they're doing that because basically other countries have become competitive, including us. So frankly, it is not in our interest to follow that. I think it is in our interest to insist that they should remain open. Now, to the extent to which they have a problem with China, I mean, they should handle it as a separate problem with China. We don't have to get involved in that. But they should remain open to the rest of the world. And the other side of that coin is that we should also remain open. I think we should avoid retreating into a kind of a protectionist shell, which sometimes I find there's a danger that we might do that. So I would say that in the area of reform, this is an important issue. So to summarize, if we can maintain macroeconomic balance, if we can give the private sector the flexibility it needs to operate, remain an open economy, both in terms of inflows of foreign investment and trade, and improve the banking system, and hugely improve our infrastructure, I think the Indian economy could very easily get back to, let us say, 7.5% growth. But if we fail to do these things, then I'm afraid there's no reason to think that we will get that, and we may just slip into the 5% growth that was there before the pandemic. So with those words, let me end at this point and invite you to ask any questions you may have.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful lecture wherein you told us about the short-term perspective, where you said that India as a country, we underestimated the impact of the pandemic. And it's slightly too early to comment on the recovery because the informal sector has not been addressed so far. I think India has a huge informal sector, which is more than 90%. So unless the informal sector is addressed, we will not be able to predict the recovery and growth. And talking about the long-term perspective, you said about that we need 7 to 8% growth, and the urban employment has shrunk, while the rural sector, the employment has slightly improved. And thank you for giving us a very clear roadmap on how to take the economy forward. Your thoughts on the private sector investment, has to drive growth, and the necessity to improve the infrastructure, which is the role of the government to drive the public sector growth, also is clear. You told about the necessity for improving the urban infrastructure, necessity to upscale the research facilities so that India can drive growth, the necessity for reduction of freebies and improving the ratio of tax to GDP, monetization of assets, efficiency of the banking system to be brought in, and you also warned us about the increase coming up in the West. I think you have given us a clear road map on how to take India to the 7 to 8% growth levels, which only will drive our economy forward. Coming to the banking sector, I just have a question. See, today in the business line, there was an article which says that the business per employee in IOB is 15.6 crores and Central Bank of India is 15 crores, while the net profit per employee is 3.5 lakhs in IOB and a loss of 2.74 lakhs in Central Bank of India. The employee strength is some 23,000 and 30,000 respectively. While ICICI, a private sector bank, has an employee strength of more than 98,000, has a business of 16 crores per employee, which is more or less in line with the public sector, and a profit of 16 lakh per employee, while HDFC with 1.2 lakh per lakh employees has a business of 20 crore per employee and a profit of 26 lakh per employee. So the difference is HDFC generates a profit of 26 lakhs per employee, while Central Bank of India generates a 2.74 lakh loss per employee. Why do you think is the reason, sir?
You're asking me?
Yes, sir.
No. Well, look, I don't want to comment on any individual bank, but it's been well known that our public sector banks are saddled with inefficient processes, excess employment, too many branches, and they've never really done the kind of radical restructuring that modern digital technology allows. The private sector banks have been able to do it. So this is the point that I'd even made earlier, that unless we allow our public sector banks that degree of flexibility so that they could actually also be as efficient, this will only worsen over time. And the truth is that, by any standard, our banks have, public sector banks have too many branches that are not productive, too many branches which are next to other branches. So it's really not clear. They're not adjusting to the world in which banking will not require branches. In fact, the trend in the rest of the world is to create digital banks which don't have any branches. So actually what's happening is the private sector is adjusting to this trend very rapidly, partnering with fintechs in order to become leaner and benefit from modern technology. Public sector banks have constraints. I mean, they're not able to do that. And I think they're not able to do that because they're government owned, and therefore it's very difficult for them to take these hard decisions. I'm not saying, by the way, that there weren't, even within public sector banks, there are differences. So you may have picked one of the weaker banks. There are better banks. But even our better banks are not, I think, are not doing as well as they could do if they were allowed to have the flexibility that is needed. Now, this is the fundamental problem of a business organization being run in the public sector, because the business organization is subject to too many political constraints which impede its ability to become highly profitable.
Mr. C.J. George from Geojit has a question that you have a strong votary of the private investments, and even today you talked about accelerated private investment for faster economic growth. However, the private sector for the last many years has been shying away from incremental investment. When the large companies are benefited from the formalization now, they don't seem to be incrementally investing enough. Your take, sir.
Well, in the last couple of years, I mean, no private company would have been interested in doing too much investment, because if you get a decline of GDP of about 8%, the demand in the system is much less than the existing capacity. The private sector will only start investing when demand picks up with the capacity that actually exists. So I'm not surprised that the private sector isn't investing. That is why my own feeling was that we could have given more of a stimulus in the current year. And I think if we had recognized how bad the downturn is earlier, we might have done that. But I think by slightly closing our eyes to the seriousness of the downturn and perhaps being carried away by over-optimistic projections, we did less of it. We did some. I mean, it's not that the government didn't resort to stimulus, but the question is, could it have done more? However, the key point about private investment is that in a cyclical downturn, you don't expect the private sector to start the investment. That's why, in my view, when the private sector is hesitant, it's a good idea for the government to get in. But the government should not be investing in the kinds of things that the private sector sooner or later will invest in. The government should use that opportunity to start building the infrastructure we need, because we don't have enough infrastructure. No investment in infrastructure would be excessive. So they should have a pipeline where, when the economy is a bit weak, they can stimulate demand by going for more investment in infrastructure.
Thank you, sir. Sir, a corollary to that, you were talking about increasing even private sector investment, even with reference to agriculture, and you were talking about, not today, I read that you were talking about even contract farming by the private sector and all that. And why do you think the farm bills had to be retracted?
Well, I think your guess on that is as good as mine. I mean, clearly, look at us. The political opposition to the farm bill perhaps was not anticipated. So, when you get a huge amount of political opposition, it's not surprising that the government steps back. I mean, had they consulted in advance more broadly, perhaps this stepping back would not have been necessary. But I think it's a good thing that the government stepped back, and now they are setting up some committee to see what the farmers really want. I think what has happened here, if you ask me, is that failure to consult frankly with the farmers and reassure them that their worst fears are unfounded has led to a situation where far too many farmers were convinced that what the government was doing would deliberately undermine the marketing systems on which they are used, they have depended for a long time. And although the government did say that that was not the intention, they're not going to get rid of mandis, they're only going to allow competing private fellows to buy the product. Somehow that came too late and people were not willing to believe it. So let's see what this consultation that's going on, and let's see what this committee that they are appointing will come up with, and maybe there'll be some resolution.
Thank you, sir. Then now there is a lot of focus on the divestment of non-strategic PSUs, but the classification of strategic and non-strategic can vary from person to person. So are we really going above board in respect to classification of strategic and non-strategic? And what's your take on this, sir? Mr. P.S. Nair.
Well, I mean, I thought that I'm not fully aware of all this, but I think Niti Aayog has made a long list of what they call the non-strategic PSUs. Uh, I mean, quite honestly, in my view, any public sector organization that is working in a competitive marketplace, there's no harm in privatizing it. It depends on what you call strategic. I mean, is a steel plant strategic? I don't think so. If you've got private sector steel plants, you could sell off the public sector steel plants too. Somehow we have this image that something is strategic. Is cement strategic? I would define strategic to be something that affects the security of the country, something that might potentially affect security, where you need either the government directly involved or you need very tight regulation. But as long as you're producing a commodity which is sold in the market, I don't see there's any great merit in putting it in the public sector, quite honestly.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as consumption and investment play a role in determining the GDP, how do you boost these two areas?
Sorry, I didn't get that. What areas?
The consumption and investment play a role in determining the GDP.
No, of course they
How
do.
do
I
you
mean,
boost
look, there are two
consumption
ways
as
of
well
looking
as
at GDP.
investment?
One is what is it that generates the supply of GDP, and the other is what generates the demand for GDP. So on the demand side, investment and consumption plus exports are the big things on the demand side. So if you want an increase in GDP, then that GDP has to be either consumed by somebody or used by somebody in the process of investment or in the form of a net export. So that's the demand side of GDP.
Thank you, sir. You were also talking about increasing the ratio of tax to GDP.
Yep.
Well, globally, it is around 11%. I think India is already in the 11%. Then how do you increase it further? Because then actually we have to bring down the tax structure to improve the compliance because other people were evading tax. Okay, it can be said that compliance part is to be improved, but in a country like India, how do you improve the tax to GDP ratio?
You see, I think this is a very technical question, and I have on a number of occasions said that the government should take a leaf out of what was done in 1991 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister, and he appointed the Chellaya committee, a committee of experts outside government, including chartered accountants, people familiar with industry, many economists, etc., to look at the tax system as a whole and to make some recommendations on what needs to be done. And personally, rather than myself shooting off an opinion, I think the time has come to have a second Chellaya committee. Let's put the best experts in the country together and look at the tax system as a whole. And frankly, when we say tax system as a whole, I also include in that customs duties, I include in that income taxes, I include in that corporation taxes, and frankly, also things like property taxes. Lots of people say that we need lots of urban investment, but the level of property taxation in India is scandalous. I mean, just go across the world and see what is the property tax that people pay compared to the property tax that we pay. Our property taxes are maybe 1/10 of what they should be. So question is, if other people, I mean, other cities, when cities expect services, uh, the way they raise taxes is through property taxes. We don't seem to be allowing, we seem to think that somehow the central government must give grants to the cities. There's no reason why that should be so. So I think we need a holistic reform of the tax system, for which I personally think a really expert committee with people who are knowledgeable about the global trends in taxation can actually make a recommendation on what is it that we need to do, and then the government can consider those recommendations and put in place a sensible tax system over the next 4 or 5 years.
Thank you, sir. Another question is on from Mr. Venugopal. His question is whether you think India is little hesitant to have more joint ventures and associations with Russia, particularly in the petroleum sector and also military, for the fear of displeasing USA.
Sorry, for doing what?
For the fear of displeasing USA, whether India should have more strategic associations with Russia.
Well, I mean, that's, I don't know enough about the strategic considerations. I'm not sure that the government, I mean, the government has all the flexibility it wants. And I think we have taken many decisions vis-a-vis Russia, like purchase of the missile system, etc., which in my view are correct. And I don't think that this will actually lead to great displeasing of the US. I mean, but if it does, you have to just face it. That's all.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Mr. Venugopal himself is on the resurgence of real estate sector. His question is, what according to you are the possible measures the finance minister should consider to boost the real estate business, as that is important for revival of economy?
I haven't thought enough about the real estate sector, but let me put it this way: when an economy is down in the dumps, people come up and say, "Well, boost this sector, boost the other segment." Every sector has a problem, so I don't see that the real estate sector has a special problem. Therefore, you should concentrate on it. If there is something that is preventing the real estate sector from moving forward, then we should certainly take care of that problem. My guess is that the biggest problems in real estate relate to land regulation, control over land, etc., which needs to be progressively liberalized.
Thank you, sir. So there is a clamor from the public to bring petroleum products under GST, while all state governments are opposing it. What's your view on that, sir?
No, in my view, it's quite clear that the petroleum products should be brought into GST. There's no question in my view. And as a matter of fact, if the GST is as wonderful a thing as we all think it is, it's very difficult to understand why petroleum products shouldn't be included in GST. See, what it will do, of course, is that where the petroleum product is actually used as an input, the tax that's paid on the petroleum product will just be rebated out. Where the petroleum product is used for consumption, like somebody buys petrol in order to drive their own car or their own scooter or whatever, then that will fall on the consumer. And that's the way it should be. And if it turns out, as a result of all this, and we're not raising enough rates, then we should look at the rate structure of GST and modernize it. A lot of people say that if you had a single rate GST, you'd raise a lot of resources, maybe with a few small exemptions. Instead, we have 5 different rates of GST, which has really led to both administrative confusion and also loss of revenue. I assume that the GST Council will look at these things, because this is not something, now it can only be done within the GST Council.
All states are opposing it.
Well, I mean, if you're running a federal system and you put it in the GST Council, then when you say all states, I don't think necessarily all states are, but you need a discussion process. I mean, within states, business should take a more active role. Why is the state opposing it? I mean, this is an area where business should talk to the state governments concerned.
So what do you think is a weak spot in economy now, other than informal sector? Weak spot in economy, other than the informal sector.
Yeah, no, I didn't get the word you were using.
Weak, W-E-A-K, weak spot.
Weak spot.
Yes, sir.
No, I mean, I think I've mentioned several weak spots. I mean, I don't think our I don't think our health system is as good as it should be. I don't think our education is as good as it should be. I mean, compared to most other similarly placed countries, our labor force is less educated. They don't have the skills necessary to function in a modern environment. We don't have a good enough infrastructure. We don't have a good enough banking system, and we have too high a fiscal deficit. So those are the weak spots. And I think also we are not giving clear signals about the need to maintain an open economy and not to have too much tariff protection.
Thank you, sir. There will be last one or two
I'm not
questions.
sure, by the way, how many. I'd be very interested in knowing how many of your own membership actually agree with these things. Because they're not, I mean, it's very easy to disagree with them. But I don't think this is being adequately discussed, certainly not in Indian business.
Sir. So how do we bring down the regional inequalities in India? That is a question from an assistant professor, Dr. Jinsi Joseph.
Well, I mean, you can't do it by a command control system, but every state has to concentrate on building its growth capacity. And that means doing a better job of education, providing better infrastructure. If you look at most of our states, the ones that are not doing well are states that are weak on education and weak on infrastructure. Now, I don't think you can continue to run a system which ignores these problems and somehow expect that the government will take care of inequality. I mean, these are the root causes of inequality across states.
Thank you, sir. The last question. Is there any social divisiveness which is impeding development?
Sorry, is there any clause?
Social divisiveness. Social divisiveness which is impeding development.
No, social what?
Divisiveness, social division.
Oh, divisiveness. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
No, look, clearly, I mean, I think right now, many people feel, and I think there's some basis for it, that there's too much social divisiveness that has crept in. And I think we need to tackle this. We cannot have a system in which there's an increase in social divisiveness. Now, you know, just to some extent, these problems are being experienced in many countries in the world. And wherever this happens, more and more people of different groups begin to feel disadvantaged, and that doesn't create an environment in which the society can move forward together. So that needs to be overcome. How it's to be overcome is a very complex issue, but I would certainly say that anything that increases social divisiveness is bad.
Thank you, sir. We have come to the end of the question and answer session.
Thank you.
I would now request, thank you, sir. It was a wonderful interaction, and you have laid out a very clear roadmap on how to boost India's growth. I would now request our Vice President, Mr. Veeramani, to say the vote of thanks.
Respected Speaker of the Day and all the participants. We have all known Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia as an able communicator by his vivid writing through his book Backstage, an insider's take on India in the reform years. He has exposed the red tapeism in the country by a simple example by narrating how Shri N.R. Narayan Murthy, co-founder of Infosys in 1983, had to apply several times in Delhi to get an import license for a single computer. Today, he has excelled as an orator too, given that his subject was an economic perspective of the India forward. I only hope that the union leaders of the public sector banks today are listening to him when he has been so vocal that the more and more banks should be privatized, because today and tomorrow we are having a strike all over India of the public sector banks against the privatization. We have, through his book, we have known him to be very, very vocal. Even while he was part of the UPA, he was very vocal in the wherever the government had failed to meet this one, and was very, very vocal in appreciating. Today we have seen that he has said this government, the present government's policy of monetization of assets is in the right direction. Sir, as regards the GST, we have seen that you have said empowerment should come from the business and not from the state governments. I think all the business community will feel proud for this suggestion of yours, and we would like to take it forward from here. The Cochin Chamber of Commerce and Industry wishes to express its heartfelt gratitude to Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia for the lecture on the India Forward series today. We would like to express our gratitude to Bank of Baroda and Medivision Diagnostics, the sponsors for this edition. We wish to thank all the participants from across the country who joined today, and the large numbers joining the lecture series has been quite inspiring. Sir, it is since we are in the Zoom platform as well as on the YouTube, what the number you would be seeing in the panel would be only through the Zoom platform, and we would know the YouTube numbers only on a day later. But the numbers are much higher, sir, and is quite inspiring. We would like to thank the technical team which has provided support for this program. As told by the President in the beginning, we will be reviving our annual Dr. Abdul Kalam Memorial Lecture, which could not be held last year due to COVID, by a talk by Mr. Madhavrao Gadgil in the month of January, and on the 8th of January 2022. For the time being, I will close by extending the season's greetings and the best wishes to one and all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for logging in.
Very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.